Hello. Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us. So we are delighted to have Eric Baudelaire with us tonight, and for this talk organized by the Department of Fine Arts. We were also very happy to welcome Eric at the Master Fine Arts program yesterday for the conclusive part of a praxis seminar entitled Display, and today for a series of studio visits with some of our students, so thanks. Eric Baudelaire is an artist and filmmaker based in Paris, France. After training as a political scientist, Baudelaire established himself as a visual artist with a research-based practice, which is for us actually super interesting, of course. Eric just comes back from Dakar, Senegal, where he was leading the Raw Academy Secession 7 from October to December 2019. This Session 7 was the occasion for Eric and his guests, such as Yon Akompe, Mati Diop, or Johanna Haldis Thomas and Khalil Jorej, to discuss expanded practices beyond film and projections, convening other artworks, archives, performances, and discussions into the exhibition space, working with printed matter, inventing new models of interaction between artist, audience, and material. In 2019, Eric Baudelaire was awarded the Prix Marcel Duchamp. His most recent film, Un film dramatique, 2019, is a documentary focused on students at the Dora Maar Middle School in Saint-Denis, a suburb of Paris that is home for communities that have long been marginalized in French culture. When shown within exhibition, Baudelaire films are part of broad installation that include works on paper, performance, publication, and public programs. In projects such as Après at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, 2017. Initiated in the aftermath of the Paris attacks on November 13, 2015, Après questions the means and the ends of art from within a museum in the present time. So thanks, Eric, for sharing some thought and works with us. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Donatella, for this introduction and for this invitation. And thank you to the artists who shared their practices with me today and yesterday. I'm going to start by showing you a short excerpt from a film, and then we'll take it from there. I think this is the right button.
Tous les présidents, on dirait, ils veulent venir pour des intentions mal. Comme l'autre, là, Donald Trump, et Marine Le Pen, elle l'a soutenu. Et elle aussi, c'est une raciste. C'est-à-dire qu'ils n'aiment pas une autre couleur de peau.
Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez de ça? C'est quoi ce phénomène?
Bah, racisme.
En fait, ouais, c'est vrai. Mais...
c'est tout, c'est racisme.
En fait, Marine Le Pen, elle est raciste. Et en fait, du genre, en gros, en fait, quand on dit qu'elle est raciste, c'est du genre, par exemple, elle aime pas des gens d'autres couleurs ou d'autres religions, un truc du genre. Enfin, je sais plus c'était quoi. Non.
C'est ça, je comprends pas.
En gros, elle disait qu'en gros, s'il y avait des gens qui étaient en France et qui n'avaient pas de papier, voilà, et ben elle les, on va dire ça comme ça, elle les renvoyait dans leur pays, quoi, en fait.
Les jetait dehors.
Ouais, j'étais de raciste.
Parce qu'elle est raciste, elle est née comme ça. Ça, c'est les gens qui savent pas coopérer avec les autres. Ils savent juste que leur couleur de peau, c'est que des racistes. Dans la vie, je connais moi des gens.
En fait,
Guy Ali, c'est un gentil et il n'est pas de la même couleur de peau que moi. Moi, je peux coopérer avec lui. Parce que là, moi, je suis pas raciste. Parce que nous, elle on dirait, elle est enfuie dans une sorte de ténèbres et tout ça, et qui l'empêche pas d'avoir les bonnes choses des autres gens de la même de couleur de peau différente. Elle veut toujours les blancs, blancs et blancs.
Ils n'ont pas assez d'emplois et de nourriture là pour déjà le pays. C'est pour ça qu'ils veulent renvoyer des immigrants. Bah oui. Comme ils n'ont pas déjà assez d'emplois pour eux, et ben ils vont pas donner des emplois en plus à ceux qui viennent d'autre part.
Bah dis-moi, si Marine Le Pen elle est élue, ça va te toucher là?
Non.
Bah si ça va me tuer.
Pourquoi tu veux que ça me touche?
Non, je suis français. Ouais, mais t'es français. Mais le truc, c'est que qui va savoir que t'as des papiers français?
Je sais pas, il y a ma carte d'identité, tout ça, ça te dit rien?
Elle est sur
Mais c'est chiant.
Hey, il a cru que j'allais venir au collège avec une carte d'identité sur moi.
Toi t'es un ouf.
Bon, ça peut affecter toute l'Europe, ça peut affecter
Ça peut infecter que ceux qui n'ont pas de papier. T'as pas de papier, mais t'es viré.
C'est gay? Mais dis-moi, eux, c'est des racistes, ils veulent virer que ceux qui sont pas européens.
Mais moi, je suis européen.
Ah bon?
Mais oui. Je suis né en France, c'est bizarre.
C'est un 100% français.
Mais oui.
La Bible française.
Si, pour avoir des origines, il faut que, par exemple, notre papa, soit papa, soit maman, mais...
Voilà, mais ton père, il est ivoirien.
Ma mère, elle est ivoirienne, donc j'ai une
Voilà.
seule origine.
T'as deux origines,
Mais
mais t'es
non.
né en France.
Mais c'est pas mon origine française. C'est juste que je suis né en France, c'est tout.
Mais voilà, mais c'est ton origine, Google.
Non, mais non.
Eh, toi, tu sais même pas de quoi on parle.
Mais non, c'est comme si moi je te dis, on va dire, toi t'es roumain.
Ouais.
Ta maman elle est roumaine.
Ouais.
Ton papa il était roumain.
Ouais.
Voilà, donc t'es roumain. Mais t'es pas deux origines. C'est pas parce que t'as grandi en France que t'as deux origines.
Oui, mais
T'as
moi,
une seule origine, sauf que l'autre.
Mais moi, est-ce que j'ai dit que je suis français?
Sauf que t'as tes papiers français, c'est tout.
L'origine de base,
C'est ce que tes parents ils sont.
Écoute. L'origine de base, c'est où t'es né. Tu peux pas. Ça sert à quoi de prendre l'origine de tes parents alors que tes parents, ils ont été nés dans un pays et toi, t'as été né dans l'autre. Tu peux pas considérer comme quoi toi, t'as l'origine de tes parents alors que t'es né dans un autre pays. Quoi? Par exemple, tu vois.
Forcément, je suis à l'origine de mes parents puisque c'est eux qui m'ont fait. Enfin,
Ils t'ont fait, mais après, fait dans quel pays?
ben, ils m'ont fait.
Voilà. Donc, t'es un 100% français, non?
Je suis français, mais je suis français d'origine ivoirienne. Laisse-toi aider, toi t'es perché.
Mais dites-moi, comment c'est possible? Vos parents, ils sont nés dans un pays, vous êtes nés dans l'autre pays. Vous pouvez pas prendre l'origine de vos pays, de vos parents où ils sont nés.
Mais si, justement, c'est ça une origine. Oh là là. Tu vas me dire, on va dire, l'origine, c'est quoi une origine?
Ouais,
C'est quoi là?
c'est toi.
Non, pas l'origine, c'est le. Genre, en fait, c'est d'où tu viens. Enfin, l'origine.
Voilà.
C'est-à-dire, on va dire.
Toi,
on
tu
va
viens
dire-
de France.
On va dire quand il y a un débat, on va dire il y a un débat. L'origine du débat, c'est sur les trucs des racistes, voilà. Donc, c'est-à-dire, c'est parti de où ça part. Et comme moi, je suis partie depuis, on va dire, ça vient du tout début. C'est-à-dire, attends, ça vient du tout début.
Voilà,
Attends, tais-toi. Mais non, je s'en fous. Ça vient du tout début de la création. C'est-à-dire, genre, c'est parti de mes ancêtres, tout ça. Ils étaient ivoiriens. Après, il y a eu les voilà. Jusqu'à mes parents. Et après, mes parents, ils m'ont fait ce que moi, je suis née en France.
Mais dis-moi,
C'est-à-dire, mon origine, c'est-à-dire mes ancêtres, ils sont nés en Côte d'Ivoire, donc je suis ivoirien. Non, tu piges rien, c'est tout.
alors dis-moi, si toi, par exemple, t'es français, t'es né en France, et t'as les papiers, et tes parents, ils sont nés en Ivoire, en Côte d'Ivoire, et Marine Le Pen, elle est élue, elle est raciste, elle va virer tes parents chez eux.
Mais non,
Parce qu'ils ont pas de papiers.
ils ont des papiers français maintenant.
Ok, s'ils ont
Non,
des papiers,
non, t'as plus le droit à la parole, non.
Non, mais s'ils ont pas de papiers, et toi t'en as.
Mais ils ont des papiers, justement, c'est ça le truc. Donc voilà.
Mais s'ils en ont pas, pense.
Mais non, je pense pas, mais parce qu'ils ont. Je pense qu'ils ont pas de papiers. Vraiment,
Lui, c'est pas c'est quoi la définition de un exemple. L'origine et la source est au premier abord le moment initial de l'apparition d'une chose.
Ouais,
C'est-à-dire
de mes
la naissance historique de cette chose. Le
Oui,
comment-
c'est-à-dire la naissance historique, c'est-à-dire
tu
la
comprends
naissance,
pas
la toute première naissance.
la chose c'est toi.
Mais non, c'est pas vrai, parce qu'ils ont dit la naissance historique. Moi, je suis pas historique. Hein. Je suis née en 2004, je suis pas
De
historique.
cette chose, le commencement de cette chose. Cependant, cette définition délaisse l'aspect logique et dynamique de ce mot.
So this is an excerpt from from Un film dramatique. It's towards the first third of the film, I would guess. So I want to start with the exhibition that just ended a couple days ago at the Centre Pompidou, and it was the exhibition of I guess those are the 4 artists who are nominated for the Prix Marcel Duchamp. So we're each given sort of a piece of the space, and my presentation was called Tu peux prendre ton temps, which means in English you can take your time, and it's a citation from Fatima Tassar, who's one of the students I was working with in this film. There's a scene in the film when she instructs my camera operator to film some pigeons on a bridge, and she tells her, because by this point we've spent 3 years together starting to working on this film, and she tells Claire, my operator, she says, you can take your time when you're filming. And she encourages her to sort of make a long shot, long take. So this was the name of the presentation at the Centre Pompidou. This was a sort of poster that was available in the space. And the presentation had 3 components. Un film dramatique, which you saw a piece of, which was presented really in as much as possible, I created a bit of a movie theater that's pretty much the same size as this space, with cinema chairs and a screen. The film is 1 hour and 54 minutes, so it's a feature-length film. It was shown 4 times during the day according to a schedule. And these are not all, but many of the students that I worked with during 4 years. This is at the opening of the exhibition at the Centre Pompidou. There were 20 in all. 20 students. Well, there were 24 at the beginning of the process, and then we lost a few along the way. And the origins of the project is what we call in French the 1% artistique, which is whenever there's a commission for a public building built in France, there's 1% of the budget which is allocated to an art commission. Traditionally, sculptors are solicited, and it generally results in a physical object inside of the building. I think this is the first time that a non-physical object resulted from this commission in the form of a film. When I was asked to present something, I told them that I couldn't make an object for the school, but I could make the school exist within the object that they were commissioning, which was the film. And that I would work with a group of volunteers, the first generation of students to enter this building. So it's a middle school, so they were around 11 when they started entering the middle school, and I worked with them for the 4 years during which they were in this building. They all graduated from middle school in the spring, and then in September we finished the film and we presented it as part of the exhibition. There's another part, which is when we visited the site, there was this sort of, I opened this door and there was a technical closet space, which normally is used to store equipment and or like wires, and it's a technical space. It's not normally an exhibition space, but this gave us the idea to use some of the additional material that we didn't find a room for inside of the feature film, to make this sort of video here, which is 13 minutes, and it's spatialized. There's a speaker in the front and there's a speaker in the back, and the sounds from different voices is not synchronized, so there's sort of, you don't hear the same thing based on where you are in the space, and you enter through this space to enter the second projection space. So this was called Prelude to a film dramatique. And the third part of the exhibition was off-site. And this was the leaflet that tells you two ways to see this flag. This work was called Beau comme un buren mais plus loin, which means as beautiful as a buren but a bit further. And there was two ways to visualize it. One was to go up to the top of the Pompidou, and there's a pair of binoculars that helped you see this flag that was placed on the building in Saint-Denis, which is in the periphery of Paris, and next to the school where we had been working for 4 years. Or it tells you how to take the metro and to go and see the flag in person by going to Saint-Denis. And I'll come back to this later. But I'm showing you this first because I was earlier trying to think about sort of in what order to talk to you tonight or what to present, and I thought about this this piece of text here. There's many strange things about these sort of prizes where they have artists some compete with each other, and there's a finalist, and then there's the finalists, and then there's a prize winner. One of the strange processes was they ask each artist to appoint somebody to do a presentation about your work, but you're not allowed to attend the session. So it's sort of like a Lacunae process where somebody is speaking for you, but you do not get to hear what they say. But I asked somebody to record it. So this was Philippe Mongeau, who's a teacher. He teaches in a high school, and he was I guess he made the case why I should win the Prix Marcel Duchamp, and obviously Philippe is a very gifted speaker because I did win the prize, and I think it's mostly because of him. But I want to go back to this one sentence that I put here in yellow, which is that one of the questions, he's sort of talking about what it is that my work is about, and he talks about the question of the author, a crisis he, meaning I, joyfully contribute to. Virtually all of my work reveals a process whereby the subject of the work becomes part and parcel of its creation, to the extent that we could hypothesize that Eric Baudelaire is actually the name of a collective artist with shifting configurations. And so this got me thinking, because I don't, as I was telling some of the students in the program today, I didn't spend years in a program or in a film or art school sort of training to become an artist. I sort of improvised it one work at a time as a self-taught filmmaker, which means that you obviously make a lot of mistakes. That means that you obviously sort of work your way through experimentations in real time. And one of the consequences, I think, is that it's possible that that you don't necessarily have the same awareness of what constitutes a practice. It's somewhat improvisational. And so I wasn't truly cognizant of many of the things that Philippe had sort of outlined in his presentation, because I don't think that I've set out 10 years ago to put in crisis the question of the author, so to speak. I think this just sort of happened haphazardly, and so I was thinking today about how this might have happened. And I think it starts in 2011 with the first feature-length film that I'd made. So the first sort of multi-year research project that turned into a film and an exhibition. So it's called The Anabasis of Mei and Fusako Shigenobu, Masao Adachi in 27 Years Without Images. And it's a project that started in 2009 when I was in a residency in Kyoto, Japan. And I started researching a small group known as the Japanese Red Army, which was a group that initially was organizing sort of in the radical fringe of post-68 politics in Tokyo, a revolutionary group that believed in armed struggle, and that, for reasons that are quite complicated, internationalized their movement and left Tokyo and settled in Beirut, Lebanon, and for almost 30 years organized, you would say, clandestine armed or terrorist activities in relationship to in support of the Palestinian cause, and more specifically of the PFLP's work. And so here, this is a picture from the film, and it's a gravestone of one of these Japanese guerrilla fighters, and it's sort of, this picture I think sort of summarizes why this became of interest to me, because here's a tomb that is in a cemetery, in the Martyrs Square of a cemetery within the Palestinian refugee camp of Sabra and Shatila. And obviously the writing on the tomb is in Arabic. The photograph is of a Japanese man, and somebody later on put a bullet through the picture. And I think this was sort of the kind of layered situation that helps explain what made it interesting for me to become an artist, is to try to peel away at these different layers and find a form to do that in. So this form, I would say perhaps this work from 2011 is maybe the first fully formed project that I think helped me establish a voice as an artist that I'm continuing to pursue today. So this was a installation view at the Museum of Modern Art in Kyoto in 2013. So the film is screened in one room. It's a 66-minute film. This is a version of it at the Witte de Witte in Rotterdam. Usually, when I show the films within institutions, I try to incorporate them within broader installations that have other components. And these are some of the other components that usually travel with the Anabasis. So there's an excerpt of a film by Masao Adachi called AKA Serial Killer on the floor. There's a slide projection of drawings by Masao Adachi, who's one of the subjects of the film. There are these sort of monochromatic silk screens on the wall that you can sort of see contain images, but images that that only kind of reveal themselves through the reflection of the light. And this is a still from the early part of the film. And so this is an email exchange between myself and Masao Adachi, which I'll let you read. So Masao Adachi is one of the surviving members of the Japanese Red Army. He lives in Tokyo. When I met him through this email exchange. I'd already been working on the film for several years, mostly working on the other character, with the other character who was Mei Shigenobu. And when I wanted to reach out to Masao Adachi, who was a former member of the Japanese Red Army, but who was also an experimental filmmaker in the 60s, and somebody who had made a number of films. He had written films for Nagisa Oshima and for Koji Wakamatsu, and he had his own practice as an experimental filmmaker, making films with a political subject matters, even making films that dealt with where the subjects of the films were left-wing terrorists. But he is, unlike Jean-Luc Godard or a number of other filmmakers of his generation, the only one who was a politicized filmmaker making films about armed struggle, who went that extra step and sort of crossed that thin line that separates making films about political situations and getting involved in the political situations directly. And for almost 30 years, he sort of gave up filmmaking to some extent and joined the Japanese Red Army that he had made a documentary about. And so this obviously led to some trouble for him because he was arrested in 1999. He was detained and in prison in Beirut, and then he was extradited to Japan, where he served a relatively short prison sentence. But one of the consequences of this past is that Japan refuses to return his passport, so he's sort of assigned to, he cannot go back to Lebanon, where his wife and his child live. He hasn't been able to travel since then. And so when I reached out to him to participate in this film project, he responded in this manner, saying that, and this was the beginning of a transaction between him and I. And the transaction is very simple, which is he said, sure, I'll tell you a story, I'll tell you a little bit about my life, but in exchange, I want you to do something for me, which is that when you go back to Lebanon, I want you to film things for me. So this is important relative to this idea of the crisis of the author, because I think from the get-go with this project, there's a transaction between the subject of the film and the author of the film. And this transaction informed the form of the film itself, which is that the film is made with images that I shot, partially sort of commissioned by the subject of the film. And obviously this became something that has become very important in my practice. Of the nature of this transaction is somewhat playful. It's not a strict commission. There's sort of a resistance on the part of the filmmaker to do exactly what the subject asks him to do. And this sort of playful exchange between subject and author has become very important for me. I'll show you a brief example. So this is an excerpt from the film, maybe 2/3 into the film.
調査する、それから実際作戦実行する前にはその辺りを全部オブザーブ観察してるとかね、なんか映画作りと僕にとってはあんまり変わらない仕方をこうやってる。映画と同じですね。最後本番つってシュートするのが作戦やるのと同じわけですから、そういう具合に考えながらいたというのは事実あります。自分は作戦に参加したことは一度もないけれども、みんなが作戦に出かけるのを送り出す。そうするとあとはイマジネーションでハイジャックのプロセスはこうだ、それでハイジャックした飛行機の中ではこうだ、それでまたどっかの国に降りて投降する時はこうだっていうのも分かるし、大使館を占拠してこうなるだろう、最後はこうなるだろうというケースワークはいっぱいするわけですから、それはシナリオを何度も書き直すようなもんですね。ですからそういう意味では私自身は実行部隊に入ったこともないし、小さいディテールを最終的に詰める作戦部隊とは別行動を取るわけですけれども、私が映画を撮るのはこう撮るだろうなと作戦についてもね考えたことは繰り返しありますよ。それはイマジネーションの中と実際の中身終わった後仲間に聞いたらイメージしたことと実行されたことの違い、こういうところがやっぱり実行っていうのはすごいもんだと思ったりするっていうのがあります。
So this is sort of the segment in the film when I'm beginning to restitute some of these images that Adachi had asked me to shoot for him. But the restitution is obviously not a first degree restitution. There's sort of a, I guess you would say, a kind of reluctance to give him exactly the kinds of images that he's asking for. This is a later work. The title is normally made up of all the permutations of letters between the F and the K, which you can always sort of decipher. And this is sort of part of it starts with this diagram here that where I came across this during my research on the Japanese Red Army, which is this multi-dimensional scalegram analysis plot showing consistencies in behavioral style for barricade siege, during which the Japanese Red Army fits sort of in this spectrum of, and this is something I found in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, an article from 2000, that I remember thinking, because this is the world I come from. In other words, my previous occupation many years ago as a political scientist was to sort of generate some of these forms. And what I found interesting when I came back to this one is that really, in a way, if I didn't have the writing underneath it, I might mistake this for a Saul Lewis. Or I might believe that there is sort of an attempt at a minimalist form, and I'm only partially serious, but what I do think, absolutely think, is that what's going on here and what I'm doing today is essentially the same thing, which is that I am trying to find a form to accommodate the mess of the world, as we understand it through a process of research. And much like these forms, which are often graphic forms, are attempts to sort of organize the results of this research into something that allows us to sort of derive some form of understanding. And this is pretty much what my practice has been as an artist. So all of this collection here, which started with sort of finding things relating to the Japanese Red Army, which is this diagram here too, sort of showing the genealogy of the factions that split off from each other as in the course of the history of the movement. So these specifically are the ones I was interested in. In a few weeks, I'm in Tokyo. I'm doing an exhibition with Naim Mohameyan, who was interested in the group to the left. And so all of these diagrams, there's about 500 or 600 of them, are all organized in this wallpaper piece. And what they all have in common is that they all have to do in one way or another with the question of terrorism. But from peer-reviewed academic journals in the fields of political science, conflict resolution, statistics, economics, business journals, psychology reviews, they all have to be academically peer-reviewed scientific journals of some kind or another. Which brings us to this piece from this project from 2014, which is called the Secession Sessions. The Secession Sessions started as a correspondence piece. It started as a correspondence piece because I do have part of the practice involves correspondence. I think this is something that I do while making other films because, as as you know, the process of filmmaking is very cumbersome, it's very expensive, it's very time consuming, it's a very sort of heavy apparatus. And sometimes on the side, it's helpful for me to sort of generate pieces that are exactly the opposite, that can be made through just a few minutes writing a letter to somebody, putting it in the mailbox, and then expecting something in return. And usually I show this correspondence. I've done quite a few of these pieces. I'll show you one later relating to the current situation with Brexit. This was meant to be a correspondence piece with a friend of mine, somebody I met in 2000, so 20 years ago in Abkhazia. Abkhazia is a country according to 7 other countries, and it is not a country according to 188 countries that do not recognize Abkhazia, because the existence of a country of a state today, sort of in a legal sense of the term, is a function of the recognition of that state by other member states of the United Nations. So there's about 190 states in the United Nations, and in order to be considered a state, you need to have a majority of other states to recognize your existence. And so most states, like Switzerland, are recognized by everybody. Some states, like Taiwan or Kosovo, are recognized by a small number of states. And some states like Abkhazia, at the time when I first visited, were recognized by nobody, and today are recognized by 7 countries. Abkhazia broke away from Georgia, so if you can visualize it geographically, sort of north of the Black Sea, north of Turkey, south of Russia in the Caucasus region. It's the westernmost part of Georgia. So according to the Swiss government, Abkhazia is actually a region of Georgia. But it seceded from Georgia in 1992, 1993 during a war that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think I was interested in going there for the first time in 2000 because this question of statehood and nations has been a bit of an obsession of mine for quite some time. And it seemed to me quite interesting that to go and see an unrecognized state, to see what exists there, how it works, how it functions, and to sort of think about these difficult questions of representation in the context of a state that exists through acts of representation, both in the political and in the sort of image sense of the term. And so I sent an image, so I met somebody over there the first time I went. His name is Maxime Gvingia, and he was somebody who was hired as my guide, as my sort of translator, and he was a young intern at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2000. And over the course of the years that followed, we became very good friends, Max and I. I was living in New York at the time. I invited Max to come and visit me in New York. He spent some time at my house in New York, and then I returned to Abkhazia in 2004. And in 2005, as a photographer, I worked on a project there. I did a book about with these early photographs. And as time progressed, Max sort of rose in the ranks of his Ministry of Foreign Affairs up until 2011, when he was actually appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs, which means that he was in charge of the foreign relations of a country that had very few foreign relations, and his job was to develop more official relations with other countries. And so for the year and a half when Max was minister, I didn't communicate very much with him because he had suddenly because we were friends. And so here he was in a very official function, and I didn't want to sort of interfere with his official obligations. When he lost his job, because there was a change of government, and he lost his job he was replaced by somebody else, I wrote him a letter, which I didn't actually expect would arrive. I wrote him a letter because I wanted to see what would happen if I sent a letter to Abkhazia from my studio in Paris in 2013, I guess it was. So I just took a piece of paper and wrote, Max, are you there? And I put it in an envelope and I sent it to Max. And then I forgot about it. And about 10 or 12 weeks later, I received an email from Max saying that he wouldn't be able to send me a letter in return, but because there's no postal system in Abkhazia, it doesn't actually function outwardly, but he would record a message to me and send it to me as an attachment to this email. And so there was a small voice recording, and he was giving me some news. And this initiated a longer correspondence that lasted about a year, where I would send letters to Max and he would respond by recording answers. But he kept all of these responses, and a year later I went to Abkhazia and I took possession of these recordings, and then I shot a film, and I used these recordings as the voiceover for the film, and the film is called Letters to Max. And this is still from Letters to Max. This is how it's generally exhibited. The film is projected. It's a film lasts about an hour and 40 minutes. This is in Seoul. And the reproduction of the letters are on the wall here. When we do, as much as possible, when we do the exhibition, what I have been very interested in doing is giving the exhibition space multiple functions. So it's a cinema part of the day, usually either in the afternoon or in the morning. The work is projected in the space, and it's dark, and it's a cinema with screening times. And the other part of the day, as much as possible, I like to turn over the space to Max. And so what we do is we just delimit a space here with the Scotch tape. This is at the Bergen Kunsthal in Norway. And this box is what we consider to be an embassy of Abkhazia. So it's not an embassy because we don't have the ability to make it an embassy, but we do have the ability to make it an embassy of Abkhazia. And Max becomes the an ambassador, and he holds, so basically we attribute a part of the budget of the exhibition to this, and Max is paid, and he does whatever he wants in the space. And so generally what he does is he receives people, he invites people to come and meet him. So we invite journalists, we invite artists, we invite academics or students, teachers, and people come and visit Max during the day. And whatever happens is between him and the viewers. There's no recordings or there's no documentation of this. This is the version that we did at the Sharjah Biennial. And this was an interesting implementation because, typically we're invited inside of white cubes, and we try to turn them into something else with the cinema or with the embassy. But here there was an opportunity for me to use the opposite type of structure, which is actually a performance space. So it was building the exhibition into the screening room instead of building a screening room inside of the exhibition space. And so we built a platform here for the embassy, and then, I don't have pictures, but the other way around, you would imagine there's a big screen, and whenever the film was showing, the space was in darkness, and there was a cinema screen, and it was like a regular film screening. This is at Béton Salon in Paris, where Max is meeting with some people. And usually during the reason that the exhibition as a whole is called the Secession Sessions is because every week during the course of the exhibition, we also organize a public program that's different in each context, in each country. Usually it's developed in partnership with the curatorial team at in the art centers that host the shows. And it's developed around this notion of what a state is, both conceptually, philosophically, and possible derivative ideas related to this notion. So for example, when we did the exhibition in San Francisco, we invited a representative of a secessionist party from Seattle who organizes a party called the Fredonia Party, and he and his fellow Fredonians argue for the secession of Washington State, Oregon, and Northern California into a separate country because it would be a sort of a large economic and self-sustaining country with ecological principles, et cetera, and obviously this was interesting for me because this idea that secessionism is always something that we attribute to sort of countries in conflict is not specifically the case. We also did this exhibition in San Sebastian in the Basque region, which has significant history of secessionist or nationalist politics. And this always gives rise to some very interesting sort of discussions. In Spain also, obviously, when we showed it in Madrid, the question of Catalan separatism was very present in the discussion. So this is an example. This was a session we did with the fellow there. He's a Georgian artist. His name is Gera Patashuri, and he's mostly a performance artist, and we invited him to take over the space for a few days. Aside from being an artist, he's also a veteran of the war between Abkhazia and Georgia. He was a conscript in the Georgian army and was sent off to the front, and he lost an ear during the war. And now he's become a performance artist, and he came over and took over the space and held some performances. And so we've done dozens of these different sort of sessions. They change every time. The only thing, what they do have in common is we always try to hold them within the exhibition space itself. This is another correspondence piece that is quite recent from last year. So this is currently shown at the Crac-Occitanie in an exhibition in the south of France in the city of Sète. So it's 52 framed letters. Just look like this. And so the letters resulted from this correspondence. So this is one of my letters to Theresa May. And it was a very sort of earnest question. And I think this idea of sort of Brexit is a complex situation because it's a bit of a crisis of, I think we're living in a time of the crisis of Western democratic institutions, in the sense that there are sort of democratic processes that are yielding results that Democrats tend to not, and I mean this in the sort of, not in the American sense of the term, but that people who believe in democracy tend to not particularly always agree with. And Brexit is really, it seems like it's resolved today because the British Parliament passed most of the legislation that will allow for Brexit to happen. But for the past 8 or 9 months, if you've been reading the papers, it really seems like it's a moment when the oldest parliament in Europe is sort of gripped, it's sort of stuck on something that doesn't know how to resolve. And so what is kind of wonderful with British parliamentarians is that they are very polite and they respond to letters. So here, sometimes they just would scribble something in the bottom of my letter, and so here to the left he says, we won't quote unquote leave Europe because of geography and culture, but we have no idea where our country is going, and we won't until one day we return to the EU. Mes regrets sont infinis. My regrets are infinite. But on the left we have, somebody who says, you say we are leaving Europe and ask where we are going. The only answer is liberté, freedom. This one is, thank you for your recent letter in which you say you are leaving Europe. Where are you going? My answer is we are not leaving Europe. We are leaving the European Union. These are two quite different things. How sad that anyone in so great a country as France should make such a mistake. Vive la différence. And then kind enough to send me this newspaper article, which might be of interest from the Times. And so it's a handwritten letter is very touching. It's wouldn't necessarily expect that members of Parliament would have time for this. And sometimes letters are really very generous. The one on the left here is really sort of very pedagogical. It's trying to explain some of the parliamentary procedures that are going to occur, and how the hope that certain processes will be in place and will avoid Brexit from occurring. Or they're briefer in the case of Lord Lamont, who says the question is, Britain is not leaving Europe, it's leaving an organization called the European Union. The question is, where is the EU going? This one is beautiful. So, dear Eric, thank you for your letter. A good question. As a staunch Remainer, I still hope for a miracle, and that we stay. And if not, I will be a refugee in France. We will welcome the Baroness Miller. And this one is quite exceptional too. I didn't realize that a number of members of parliament are actually part of the clergy also. I don't know if it worked. Amen. So I think I'll skip this partially because we're going to run out of time, and I also talked about it in the seminar yesterday. But this was images from the previous exhibition at the Pompidou, just in 3 words. The idea was to present a film in the large space and then to pull 50 or 60 works from the collection and sort of place them within the space as a means of sort of investigating different possible subterranean dialogues between modern and contemporary works in the collection, and this film dealing with the journey of a young Frenchman who went to join the Islamic State in Syria in 2014. And here also we held daily public programs within the space on a number of topics sort of related either closely or rather distantly from these questions. And I skip that. Which brings us back to Tu peux prendre ton temps. So this is Fatimata to the left and Ibrahima on the left. Fatimata on the right and Ibrahima on the left. The first day they were given cameras because the first 2 years of the project, essentially I would go to the school with a team of sort of adult filmmakers, so to speak, and we would have conversations and we would discuss really what it is that we were doing together. Because I didn't have a whole lot of ideas of what exactly this film would be, and I tried very much not to. I think the idea of doing the film over the course of 4 years wasn't so much to watch them grow, even though this is one of the consequences. The idea of doing the film over 4 years was to give ourselves a tremendous amount of time so that we could make a film without me ever having to do something which I would not want to do, which is to teach them something. So I specifically did not go to Dohamar with the intent of teaching anything to anybody, because I think that's, I remember Nicole Brenez, who's a friend of mine and a wonderful historian of cinema at the Sorbonne and a specialist of Godard and of militant cinema in particular. And a few years ago, she accepted a job at La Fémis, which is the sort of national film school in France, and she teaches first-year students there, sort of the history of cinema. And I asked her, so how's it going, and how are your students? And she says that they're wonderful. They when they come in, I see all kinds of really wonderful things in the first few weeks, and then gradually, as time progresses, as they become formatted by the school, I stop seeing wonderful things. And I had this idea that the last thing I should be doing with these 11-year-olds is really sort of telling them what to do. Instead, we just sort of spent time together and sort of let things happen spontaneously. So the first piece that the excerpt we saw at the beginning of the evening is not something that I organized or orchestrated. It kind of happened. You can sort of hear my voice on one or two occasions of maybe asking a question or perhaps bringing the conversation back to something, but it's not directive. It's very much about seeing what spontaneous situations can be generated without much guidance from me. And sometimes we sort of created these fictions together where we went traveling to the sea. I'll show you a piece. And going to the sea has meant, this was during the presidential elections, and at one point, two of the students became candidates. This is the last part of the exhibition, which I showed you before, which is Beau comme un Buren, mais plus loin, so it's beautiful as a Buren, but a bit further. And this is Dafa Diallo, and she, so she kind of made we talked about this piece we wanted there to be, as in the previous exhibition I did at the Pompidou, a piece from the collection brought into the show. And so we looked at different aspects of the collection, and we liked this work by Daniel Buren that's called Les Couleurs. And it's a piece from 1974. It's a series of his flags are you familiar with the work of Daniel Buren? He works a lot with these 10.5 centimeter stripes, post-conceptual institutional critique. And the flags were placed on monuments inside of Paris, generally sort of historical monuments like Notre Dame, La Sorbonne, Le Panthéon. And then there was a longue vue, there was a pair of a powerful, like a telescope or whatever it's called, a long lens from which you could see these flags around Paris from the roof of the Pompidou. And so I thought, well, great, I'll ask Daniel Buren if we can activate the piece, but I asked him if he was okay with the students reinterpreting his flag, and he said no. And so I said, well, that's okay. So what we'll do is the piece won't be we won't borrow Daniel Buren's piece. We'll make a new piece, which is called As Beautiful as a Buren, but a bit further. And it's a bit further because instead of putting the flag, obviously, in these monuments inside of Paris, we put it on the Tour Pleyel, which you can see in the background, which is this very tall tower that's in the middle of the neighborhood. This is the school, so it's right next to the school. It's right next to where most of the students live. This is in Saint-Denis, which is in the suburb north of Paris. And the building is important because it's about 40 years old and it's currently undergoing a complete renovation. It's been stripped entirely, so it's just a skeleton now. And they are going to transform it into a luxury hotel for the Olympic Games that will be held in France in 2024. So there'll be a swimming pool up top. There will be a sort of a restaurant with views around Paris. And so this is kind of the last chance that we had to get up top there during the construction. And so Dafa, we blew her drawing up into a huge flag, and it flew there until a couple days ago. And you could see it from the Centre Pompidou with binoculars. And perhaps to conclude, I'll just show you another part of L'Imprime Dramatique.
la différence entre le son et un bruit?
Ben, le son, ça provient d'un objet, qu'il n'y a que lui qui peut le faire. Et un bruit, c'est par exemple quelque chose qui se forme à partir d'un objet, mais le son n'appartient pas à l'objet. Non, regarde, par exemple, non, mais par exemple,
Répète.
il y a une trompette, ça a son bruit personnel.
Ouais.
Et si par exemple il y a un autre instrument qui essaie de l'imiter, ben ça sera un bruit, puisque il y a que la trompette qui fait son son.
Ouais.
Voilà. La trompette elle fait son son à elle, et s'il y a un autre instrument qui essaie de recopier son son, ça va être un bruit, puisque
Pourquoi? Mais non, ça va être un bruit.
puisque c'est pas le même son.
Mais le troupe aussi va faire un son. Un son? Mais oui. C'est comme si moi je fais ça. Mais après toi tu refais ça, putain.
Mais alors c'est quoi la différence entre un bruit et un son?
Je sais pas moi, un bruit, je sais pas, peut-être c'est quand tu fais je sais pas moi, c'est quoi la différence? Un son et un bruit, c'est un son, c'est voilà quoi. Et un bruit,
Voilà,
si.
voilà, j'ai retrouvé ma
voilà.
réponse.
Un bruit c'est quelque chose qu'on peut imiter, alors qu'un son on peut pas.
Ouais, c'est ça.
Ouais, et aussi, un bruit, c'est plus un truc que t'as envie de frapper, et un son, c'est plus un truc que t'as envie de chanter. Si. Par exemple, ça, t'as pas envie de frapper ça?
Mais non, quand tu fais ça, tu fais un bruit, tu siffles.
T'as envie
C'est
de
pas,
danser, chanter,
c'est pas forcément quand tu siffles, tu
Qui
fais un
t'a dit
bruit.
qu'on fait pas un son là?
Mais non, ça c'est pas ça, c'est un bruit, non?
Je sais pas
C'est
moi,
un
c'est quoi la
son.
différence? Un bruit, je
C'est un
sais
bruit.
pas.
C'est
Dans la
un son,
nature,
c'est un
quand
bruit.
Quand on parle, c'est un son.
Non, mais
Ouais,
ça...
quand on parle, ouais, ça fait du
Oui,
bruit.
c'est un bruit.
son quand on parle. Et quand la preuve, regarde, tu sais, quand tu parles, mais tu fais un son aussi. Y a pas de. Ça, tu m'imites, ça fait pas ça fait du bruit. Toi, t'es bizarre.
Ça veut dire que ça provient pas seulement des objets. film. Mais un film sur quoi? Vous dites c'est un film, c'est un film. Il y a des films, je sais pas, il y a des films de tout. Oh là là. Mais là, tout ce qu'on a tourné, c'est pas un documentaire.
Mais attends, mais c'est un film.
Il n'y a pas une voix qui parle et qui
C'est un
dit,
film de quoi? C'est un film de quoi?
ça,
C'est un film de quoi là?
Mais c'est un film.
Un
c'est
film
pas
voyage,
c'est un
le
film.
voyage.
Mais alors toi, c'est un documentaire de quoi?
Mais c'est un documentaire de la vie des collégiens.
Waouh.
Aussi, ça peut être un film de la vie des collégiens.
Mais c'est un film sur quoi? C'est un film dramatique, c'est un film marrant, je sais pas si c'est un film.
Est-ce que là on a parlé sur nous?
Un film, ça peut être pour
Là,
exprimer
là,
quelque chose.
on peut dire, vas-y, c'est un film
Mais
drama.
forcément, si c'est un film, attends, si c'est un film, forcément il y a un thème, je sais pas.
Ok,
je sais
on va
pas.
dire.
Mais
on
là,
va
on a
dire-
fait des bruitages.
Mais attends, mais tu vas me dire, le film c'est un film, c'est une comédie, c'est un drama.
Voilà.
je sais
Et
pas
toi,
quoi.
c'est un
Voilà.
documentaire de quoi?
Mais c'est un
Voilà,
documentaire
ok.
de la vie des collégiens.
Je vais te dire, par exemple, là, on peut dire que c'est un film dramatique, vu qu'on c'est dramatique, on a oublié le son à Saint-Denis, et qu'on a besoin du son. C'est dramatique, c'est comme si tu meurs. C'est comme si dans un film, il y a une personne qui meurt, c'est dramatique. Mais là, c'est comme si le son, il est mort et il est resté à Saint-Ouen, c'est dramatique. Ça revient à la même. C'est dramatique, oui ou non?
Non. Mais là, on n'a pas expliqué genre la vie des collégiens. On n'a pas dit tous les matins on se lève. On n'a pas
Mais
dit
non,
ça. C'est pas un
mais alors,
documentaire.
quand on fait le truc là, on n'est pas en train de parler pourquoi, je sais pas quoi, on faisait des gestes, tout ça là.
Des gestes de.
Mais là, on est en train de raconter.
Oui.
Ouais,
On était en train de raconter.
Mais c'est pas un documentaire.
Ils étaient en train de raconter comment nous, on a subi le choc, le son, et
Voilà,
le son a disparu.
comment on a géré la situation.
Mais justement,
Mais c'est pas un documentaire.
Juste, est-ce que c'est vraiment un film ou un documentaire?
Faut que tu m'aides parce que je sais pas.
Alors moi je dis c'est un film, c'est fantastique, le son, il peut pas rester à 100 ans comme ça, et c'est un truc fantastique. Les caméras prennent vie, comme dans un film fantastique, et se décident de se manifester pour rester dans leur ville natale, et font un dysfonctionnement de eux-mêmes pour que ceux qui l'utilisent par la tête. Voilà. C'est un film magique. Je fais un cadre.
Thank you. Questions? Do we do?
So you trained as a political scientist, and then morphed into art. How did that come about? Could you expand some?
The morphing took 10 years and it went through a number of other occupations, which I won't list because it would be tremendously boring, but it's just the life of somebody who doesn't really know what to do. And so I worked in a seafood restaurant. I tried to be a journalist for a little while. I worked in websites. I then I became a photographer, and I think that was what made me more structurally interested in images. But I briefly attempted to be like sort of a straight documentarian because I was interested in sort of, that's what got me to Abkhazia the first time, was the idea of maybe doing a documentary, a photographic documentary. I went there with a writer under this idea of sort of James Agee, Walker Evans sort of idea of documenting a political process or a historical situation with text and with images, and the idea of doing a book. But it failed because, and I think this is perhaps the importance of Abkhazia for me, is that it's in Abkhazia that I understood that a lot of things that we were trying to do were not going to work. Because the situation of a state that is unrecognized, it's a very conceptual problem. It's something you can't photograph, so to speak. You can photograph the effects of not being recognized. Problems in reconstruction after war, architecture, problems of malnutrition and tuberculosis epidemics, or the empty houses of Georgian refugees that have been ethnically cleansed from Abkhazia. You can photograph these things, and a writer can write about them. But what became the impression that was very strong for me was that there was something other and somewhat larger than the documentation of these sort of situations that was interesting to me. And that's why I kept on going back to Abkhazia to look for other forms that could start to sort of unpack some of the very complex philosophical, political, historical observations that we were making with my friend Dove, who's the writer and who I traveled there with many times. And so I think that's the process that really got me focused on the idea of these forms, right, which are films, but also these exhibitions where we invite people to come and discuss, invite people from different fields, academic fields, activist fields. This idea that the space that we call the space of contemporary art is actually just a very, very open proposition, that within which you can make different attempts to explore something as complicated as the unrecognized state. I mean, a state itself is a very difficult thing to explain. A federal state, a confederate state, but a non-recognized state aspiration is like a concept within a concept. And so you have to, and so this has kept me busy for a long time within the field of art, because everything is possible. You can do a performance, you can propose a film. I remain very interested in the question of images, but not only. And when I feel like a film doesn't address all of the things that I'm interested in addressing, then the space of the exhibition can allow us to do other things. So I think this was the slow process that got me to doing what I'm doing. And I go back to this idea of finding a form to accommodate the mess. It's a citation from Samuel Beckett, who defined art, the role of the artist as the task of the artist is to find a form to accommodate the mess.
On this last sentence, you raised the question of authorship, and for the project with the school children, you must have tons of film material, sound material. You didn't say anything about the editing. Is it your individual authorship, or is that joint authorship as well?
It's a very good question. The editing is the space that I reserve for myself. And possibly that is what makes, the credits on the film are very long. I think they last like 5 minutes. When somebody asked me, because the film is going to be shown on television on Arte, and they don't do 5-minute credits. They do 30-second credits that go like this. And I said, no, I can't give up the length of the credits. I had to give it up a little bit, but I negotiated 2.5 minutes. But the reason why is because it's very complicated to attribute roles to all of the activities that made this film. And so in the credits, we try to really spell out sort of how this distributed creation came about. And so the ideas are from everybody. The context is something I provided. The filming, half of the material in the film is shot by the students. The other half is shot by 3 adult camera operators. So the credits try to explain all of this. And what happened when they're filming or when we're filming is something that the group generated. And this is why I do think that it is a film that really questions the notion of authorship within the collective endeavor of making a film. But the editing room was not a collective space. And this is a conviction that I have that there are many different moments in the fabrication of a film, and that the moment of editing is a very intimate moment that concerns the filmmaker and the editor. And that this is something that is ritualized, and I work with Claire Atherton, who's an absolutely amazing person and editor, and we spend 15 weeks discussing, trying things, the two of us, before we showed it to the students. But something that is very important is that the students did not wait 4 years to see something. We made intermediate forms almost every year that we shared with the students, that we sometimes showed. We did exhibitions in Leipzig with 3 hours worth of intermediate forms. We showed it sometimes in film festivals. We showed them in Tokyo. Over the course of 4 years, there were intermediate forms. And these intermediate forms were very important because even though we did not include the students and the voice of the students into the editing room for reasons that I just explained, because I don't think that is the space of editing, collective space. I don't think it's possible to collectively make good decisions in editing. But seeing the intermediate objects informed the process, created discussions, and these discussions informed what they shot in the next 2 years. And so there was a conversation between the editing and the collective fabrication of the images, even though the editing itself was not a group endeavor. Does that make sense?
I like the Beckett quote, and I understand that you arrived to art, your artistic practice, and also these projects with this desire to find the right mess for to find the form for the mess. But how much are you thinking about the audience? You know, whether it's an intermediate form or a final form, in terms of, are you making editorial decisions or also choosing a subject matter and a way to approach that subject matter based off of what you're interested in, how you want that form to be? Or are you thinking about how the students would receive it, or a certain artistic audience? But also I think there's an interesting tension, because this work can be in a gallery, or it can be on art tape, and those are very different delivery mechanisms to a form and a mess.
I think from the moment you decide to make a form, you are acknowledging that there will be an audience, unless it's a completely private form. So that's how I think of the audience, in the sense that there will be an audience. But that's about as much thinking I give to who that audience is, because I don't think it's not in my nature, and I don't think it's an interesting way to work. The point of being in this open space of art is to not have that constraint, which you might have in commercial television, or you might have in mainstream cinema today, of having to deal with people who, in the marketing department, who are concerned about what the audience thinks or will think or project. And this is one of the things that creates this tremendous uniformity in contemporary commercial cinema, which is that we've gone from a very broad range of commercially available films to films that are, for 90% of them, do exactly the same thing, that are workshopped by the same people, that are studied by the same marketing departments, and that are slowly killing the medium. The point of working in this space is to not have to think of an audience, because most of the time when we think of an audience, or when people think of the audience, they make mistakes. They don't know. you know, if I try as much as possible to work without any of these constraints. I produce my own films and I try to get the funding myself, so I don't have to answer to anybody else. If I were to answer to somebody else, if I were to make this film on commission, half of this film would not get through the proper approval things. But the fact of the matter is that once the film is finished and you impose it as it is, it works. There is an audience for these films. One of the reasons why these neighborhoods are never portrayed the way they are in this film, you know, there's a film right now in France that's doing tremendously well. It's called Les Misérables, and it's a film that takes place in the banlieue. It's a story of, you know, police brutality, and it's a wonderful film. But it is a film that does exactly what we expect films that deal with these inner city neighborhoods to do. It's about the violence of living in these inner city neighborhoods, the police, the blah blah blah, et cetera, et cetera. It's very rare to find a film that doesn't focus on these questions. And I think the only way to make that work is if you can function within a space that doesn't have this sort of supposed obligation to think about the audience, because I think that's the best way to sort of strangle the possibility of a different form. So I make the film that makes sense for me and for Claire Atherton and for people who work together. Who, you know, I invite people into the studio occasionally to look at it and to have a discussion, but it's a very limited and very specific set of people who I look to for very specific reasons. And then we put it out into the world, and if it has a life, it means it has an audience.
Do the students know what kind of film it is now?
They don't agree.
They do?
They don't agree. We have this discussion as a ritual now. We had it Sunday at my house when they came over to celebrate the end of the exhibition, and they performed this argument at will. Become very good at performing this argument at will. We did also agree that we would make another one 3 years from now. And I think they had a really interesting idea, which is that I asked them, okay, if we make another one, then when do we make it, and how do we make it, et cetera, et cetera. And now they're all in different schools because they're in high school and they don't all go to the same high school, so they're in like 6 or 7 different high schools. And they had a really smart intuition, which I don't know that I would have had, which is to say, let's make the next one the day we finish high school, not during high school. And they had this intelligence of saying, what's interesting now is like what happens after school, and after school starts the day after we graduate. And so some of them will go to have gone to professional high school, some of them will drop out of high school, some of them will go into general studies and might go on to higher education. But their idea was to say, if we start the next film the day after we graduate, then it'll be about something completely different. It'll be about how we enter life after school. And I think that's very interesting, and I don't know how it will work or in what process it will involve, but that's the idea.
Just I don't know, perhaps an anthropological observation. I noticed that in the movie the boys were really like very talkative and really liked to argue, to have lots of arguments, and the girls were kind of more silent. Is that something consistent in the, or is that specific to the sections we've seen?
Yes and no. I mean, this did occur to me before choosing these 2 sections, because I realized that this problem would, or that this sort of characterization was present. So it's more, I certainly chose the 2 pieces where David and Dionys are sort of, that I think they work together. They have this sort of running argument between the 2 of them. But in the group of 20 students, there was only 5 boys, and the film is the role of the I would say the input of all the students is not necessarily as gendered. It's true that like the rhetorical sparring is something that those 2 specialize in, but most of the images that are provided in the film by the students come from Fatimata and a number of from Lina, and so it's sort of like I didn't sort of gender this participation in a way, or sort of try to understand how and whether or not it was gendered. But in terms of input into the film, it doesn't. There is no sort of imbalance in that way, aside from this rhetorical jousting, which I think is related to the specificities of that age and what school fabricates also. I think French schools really fabricate, the art of talking. And I think that it's possibly that the competitive nature of the boys in this group stimulates them more than some of the girls who are not interested in this degree of jousting, although there are also scenes where it's the girls that are disagreeing about stuff.
How often did you work with the students?
I went there usually every 2 to 3 weeks for 4 years.
And then one day or?
I would spend an afternoon there. And so there were like 2 or 3 hours that were set aside where we had a room and we could meet. And they usually would meet in subgroups, like half for 1 hour and then the other half for another hour, because 20 kids, you're in the minority, you're a very small minority and you lose. So it's better to have like smaller groups where we could do things differently. But then when we went on the trip, we all went together, and the groups were changed over the years. But that was generally the method. And past a certain point, when I would go to the school, I would no longer go with a film crew. I would just go by myself or with my assistant, and we would talk, and we would look at what they were filming, and I'd say the first 2 years we filmed a lot. And then the next 2 years we filmed far less. They did most of the filming.
How is it within the frame of, you mentioned it was a commission, like the 1%.
Yeah.
How is it then presented to the school? Is it something that's there physically, or you run the project on by saying the process is what is important and I will do with over 4 years, but without something,
right.
Does the film exist somewhere for them?
What I did not want to do is what a number of other artists did propose for the school, because they were a number of people making films that were competing for this commission. I was very specific about the fact that I did not want this to end up on a plasma screen in the hallway, which is what several of the other projects were proposing to do, that the film would end up being like a piece inside of the architecture. I said that the experience of working with these kids would be one of the central things, and then the other central thing would be that we would make a form, and that this form would be put back into the public realm, first through festivals and exhibitions, and when we're done with that, it'll go on YouTube. And so that's the idea, is that it'll go back into the public realm, but on USB keys, on whatever form it wants to circulate in. So it'll exist as a public art piece, so to speak. And if they want to put it on a plasma screen in the school, they can. I don't think they will.
What did Ada Chimazo think of the images that he commissioned you to shoot, and did he ever use them for a project?
I'll ask him, because I'll see him in a couple weeks. But no, he still has not used them. He's threatened to use them several times in different projects, but one of the characteristics of his practice is that he really changes ideas very, very quickly. He's somebody who gets bored with his idea from yesterday. And so he tried, I think he initially wanted these images because this was at the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, and he wanted these images because he was interested in making a film about the so-called Arab Spring with images from Lebanon. And then as things evolved, and then there was the war in Libya, and then he became interested in something slightly different and ended up making a very different kind of film about something else, and he didn't really use the images. He has them. And we've talked a bunch about the film. That's now been 9 years, and we've shown it many places in Japan, and he's been able to come, and we're doing it again at an exhibition in Tokyo in a couple weeks. We made another film together after this, which is called The Ugly One, which was a strange project. It was related to a prize that another prize I won, this thing called the Audi, the car manufacturer. prize, and they gave me a huge amount of money to make a film. And what I did is I commissioned a screenplay from Masawa Dachi, because he had not written a screenplay for somebody else in 20 or 30 years. And so the game was, I commissioned the screenplay, so I paid him to write a screenplay that he said, if I will write a film that you will not be able to make. And so I was in Lebanon, and he would send me pieces of the script every day, and true to his word, it was a film that cannot possibly be made because the story is impossible. It's like a Moebius strip. And the idea was, because this is, I think, is what interests him, is like what happens in the face of this kind of impossibility, like what solution will I find? And so it's a very experimental, strange narrative film. It's a feature film with actors and with like a story, but the film halfway through becomes a film about its own impossibility and how we resolve it. We have a third project that we were hoping to make sometime that would be using this sort of, because he comes from, his earliest films are sort of very influenced by surrealism, and we had this idea of making what's it called, a cadavre exquis, an exquisite corpse film, where like I would film something and then he would get the last minute, and then he would film something from that minute, and then send me the last minute, and then we would open it up at the end and it would be a strange looking film. He would film in Tokyo and I would film in Paris, but we haven't yet put it in place because we haven't yet found the time or the money to do it. All right. Thank you.